Hi Chris, welcome. If you could start by telling us a bit about yourself, how did you get started in refereeing and what motivated you to pursue it at the highest level?
Right. Okay. By chance, I started refereeing. I come from Cheltenham, and when I was 17, I was playing rugby at school, and I happened to be relaxing, 17, 18, shall we say, in town, and Cheltenham Saracens thirds were wandering around town, and they had a game the next day, and I didn't have a match to play, so they were looking for a referee, and apparently I agreed to do it on the Friday night, and I woke up on the Saturday morning thinking, right, what have I agreed to? Now, my father was a teacher, and he'd done a little bit of football refereeing. He had a whistle, so I had a little chat with him in the morning. And I'd always been brought up in Cheltenham. Cheltenham's a town with a lot of rugby history, and it's something I'd always watched from the age of 6 or 7. And we'd had a basic idea of the rules and the laws. And yeah, I agreed to referee this game, which was played at Burrows playing field. The home side won 15-12. Cheltenham Saracens beat Evesham. There might have been a controversial moment at the end where I gave a penalty to the home side, but everyone seemed quite happy. The dog and the two people watching seemed to think it was a good decision. And they took me back to the bar and they said, right, you're the referee, here's your glass. I said, what do I need for that? So we just go up to the bar and tell them you're a referee and they'll fill it for you. And as an 18-year-old at the time, I thought this is great. So that's basically the story. And that was at the Copa bar, which was known as the Star in those days. So that's how I got into it. And there were no young people refereeing in those days. Now it's quite ironic looking at the university and the young people that are coming in and they're starting at 14, 15. I think the youngest person refereeing in locally was probably 35 at the time. So for me as a 17-year-old, I still loved the game. I enjoyed playing, and I carried on playing. I went to Swansea University, and women's rugby was just starting. I ended up being another long story. I ended up being one of their coaches. I used to referee their games. So I played and refereed, and I think that's really quite important that you can do both. And I would say to people if they wanted to come to university, there's no reason why you can't play the game on a Wednesday for the university, referee on a Saturday, Sunday. There's so much rugby to be refereed out there. So my story is unusual, but yeah, it was quite fortunate, I think, when I look back, that I said yes.
That's amazing. So obviously the World Cup's on at the moment. You've refereed on the biggest stage, on the international stage. You've obviously refereed in World Cups. What would you say the biggest game is that you've refereed in your career?
When people ask that question, they usually, on paper, you would say, right, what's the highest level game? So that would be the semi-final of the World Cup in 2003 when England won. Um, it was Australia against New Zealand. It was in Sydney. It was very hot. I remember that. It came in at half time. Somebody put ice on my head, my neck, my leg, my backs. I think they were trying to cool me down. But that was an excellent game of rugby. And Australia beat New Zealand that day, which was it was an epic match. And then I thought, right, I've done my bit for that 2003 World Cup. I'd been to the 99 World Cup and ended up running the line in the semi-final, which was a huge experience for me as a younger referee. That was between South Africa and Australia. And 2007, I ran the line again in a semi-final, remembering that England had played in the finals in 2003 and 2007, which takes you out of the running, which I always say to people, I was much better that England won the 2003 World Cup final than I was refereeing it. And I mean that quite sincerely. So those are the games that you would say were the biggest ones. And then I also was fortunate enough to referee 4 European Cup finals and 3 Premiership finals, and even 2 Celtic League finals, which was a bit of a collector's item as an Englishman, refereeing 2 games, one in Cardiff and one in Dublin for those competitions. But and then 17 years in the Premiership. So look, very fortunate to being able to do that. Yeah.
What would you say is like your most memorable experience as referee on the international stage?
Obviously, when people you tend to think of that semi-final as being one of the key games, and you get the build up for it. And obviously, being in Australia, you're in the home country, they win the game. That will stick in your mind. When I look at the most enjoyable game, it was also a World Cup game, which you probably wouldn't think was the case. New Zealand played Portugal in 2007. It was the first time the Portuguese had managed to get to a World Cup final. And they were probably the 21st or 22nd best country in the world, and they were playing New Zealand. And I remember being given the fixture about 6 or 7 weeks before the World Cup started. And I went to the local running track and started doing 300-meter sprints because I'm thinking this game is just never going to stop. The Portuguese gave it absolutely everything. Before the game, the Portuguese team held hands and walked out onto the pitch holding hands, and the New Zealanders had their line next to them. The New Zealanders' line was twice as big as the Portuguese line for the simple reason that they were twice as big. And the crowd were fantastic. I've never heard an anthem sung like the Portuguese sang that day. It was beautiful. I've got a recording of it. It was passionate, and they got absolutely thumped by, I think, about 116 points to 10. But the spirit in which that game was played was absolutely wonderful. And afterwards, they shared beers together. Nobody got hurt. It was, as I said, the anthem singing was fantastic. Um, and that's what rugby can give you. It was a very special occasion, but it wasn't the biggest game. It was the one one of the ones at the top level which I enjoyed the most.
How was that experience? Obviously, refereeing New Zealand, obviously, like before the game, they got the hack and stuff like that, and I think that's just sort of an amazing thing in rugby. Like, what was that experience like, witnessing it firsthand on the field?
It's a good question. I love it, and I think it's a really special part. And everything that's unique about the game, I think you need to protect. And the haka, the first time you come across it, and I've been to New Zealand and I've refereed school rugby before test matches, and they all have their own version. So even in a field in the back of a school somewhere, it's a very special moment. When you're actually about to kick off a game like that New Zealand game against Australia, I probably deliberately don't over focus on it, because you're about to go and do your job. And if you're looking that way and your tension's taken from it. So I tend to enjoy it afterwards. I remember one game between Tonga and New Zealand, and I was one of the officials there, where the Tongans actually advanced and the New Zealanders, they ended up in the middle of each other. And it was just such a spectacle. All done in the right way. And it's a challenge. And that day with the Portuguese, they laid down a challenge and the Portuguese accepted it.
Obviously now you are leading the you now lead the officiating scholarship program at the university, which was the first in the UK of its kind. Could you tell us a bit more about the program?
Yeah, absolutely. It started off in 2003-04. Around that time, I was involved in the World Cup, where I was doing a bit of work with my club, with the university, to develop facilities and talk about training program. I was chairing a group, and I was introduced to a number of scholars at the university. And I said, well, there's the football scholar, a rugby scholar, hockey scholar, netball scholar. Where's the officiating scholar? And everybody laughed and said, well, we haven't got one of those because you don't have that. And I thought, well, perhaps we should start that. So that's when the program began, and we began to set up something which, on a lower level, obviously replicated what happens in the professional game. You want strength and conditioning, you want sports psychology, you want technical advice, and even more importantly with the referees, you want to have that feeling of being a part of a team. Quite often it can feel it's an individual act that you're doing, but at the university we've got a team. So we put together a bit of a program, and the first person to roll in 2004 was an 19-year-old chap called Matthew Carley, who's now at the World Cup. Now that tells you a little bit about the time span it can take for a referee to develop. It's like I like to think of it as a good red wine. It takes a little time to develop. You have to have a lot of experience. You have to be put in the right environment. So he was the first one to come along, and since then I did some numbers this morning. We've probably had at least 80 scholars who've come along in lots of sports. Obviously rugby, football, netball, bocce, hockey and cricket that have come along. And they all work very closely together. Obviously they come and they go in their careers, develop in different directions, but we try and give them that support. So at the moment, on Monday night, they would have been doing strength and conditioning as a group. Today, some of them are out refereeing. I would quite often on a Wednesday go and have a look at those and just give them some just general advice. I talk about it as being a movie rather than a snapshot. They're developing as people, they're developing on their courses, they're having experiences outside of refereeing. That all adds to the package, if you like. But it's something that I really enjoy, and I love the enthusiasm of the young people.
That's great. We currently obviously have two alumni who are officiating at the World Cup. Could you just talk us through their journey of being a part of the scholarship program, and now how they've gone from that and now are refereeing on the biggest stage in rugby?
Absolutely. I mean, it really is incredible when you think about it, that there's 24 officials, I think, including the TMOs who are at the World Cup. To have two of them that came from one university, and it is noticed, and it's not just them, we've got people at levels just below as well, not just in rugby. From those 80 people is really quite incredible. If I look back to Matthew, as I said, he was the first scholar to come through the door, and he was joined a year later by a football scholar. And so he was very much the pioneer. And I can still remember going to watch him referee at the Royal Agricultural College, as it was then, referee his first game. And with a smile on his face, being 18, 19, he then had 3 years where we gradually began to develop what the program was about. But obviously we spent a lot of time. He came to big matches with me, And that's one of the other things we do, is that we go and sit and watch higher level referees and we discuss those. We have seminars on all sorts of aspects of management of people and communication during the year. We get experts in. So Matthew would be an expert that I would invite in. Christoph comes in, he lives locally, he still works with the guys. So Matthew's journey, 3 years here, he went back then, he was doing the teacher training college route, so he went back and actually studied, but he then continued his refereeing. I picked up with him again as he got towards the elite end, so it was lovely to be back working with Matthew. I knew that movie at the beginning, and I could see the journey, and now I look at the snapshot on television now, and it's very rewarding all round. Christoph was a slightly different case. Christoph was a very good player. I think he played for representative rugby under 16, under 17. He was on Leicester's books, and very unfortunately he broke his collarbone. He was put back in peace. They did a really good job. He went back on the pitch. Unfortunately, the same thing happened. So at 17, he was lost to the game, and Leicester were very good. They contacted me through my other role and said, we've got a young player here who we think has got something about him. Now, Christoph had never thought about refereeing, and I sat down with him up at Leicester, and I was involved here. So I said, Christoph, what are your qualifications? He said, well, I haven't really given that a lot of thought. So we talked to him, and we then invited him to come to Gloucestershire University. And there's a scholarship going on, and I can still remember his first games around the corner at Cheltenham, doing local games in Gloucester, where he was probably in his first 10 or 20 games of refereeing. So Christoph really has been on that journey, and what's really nice, by the time he'd finished here and he'd extended his studies so he could do a bit more refereeing for 4 years, he more or less walked straight into a job as a professional referee because he was that good. But that journey in 4 years was incredible. And I'm not saying everyone can do that. And it was the right time and the right place, and he had a huge understanding of the game from his playing ability, which helped him accelerate his refereeing. But I look back now, he lives in Cheltenham, he comes back and helps with the scholars on some days. When we go and watch matches, he'll come and sit with them. He's an absolute role model to these people, and he'll sit for an hour or two and talk to them about refereeing, which is the other thing you get with refereeing, is you're constantly modelling behaviour. So you're saying, this afternoon, for instance, we've got a new scholar in, first week in the university, second week, he's going to a game in Gloucester. I can't be there. One of the other scholars is taking him. That scholar is more experienced. That scholar will help him and coach him, and the whole thing continues. And that's very, very pleasing to see.
Yeah. So obviously, as we said, you've refereed at the highest stage of the sport. How do you help scholars by sharing your knowledge and experience of mentally preparing for these games and dealing with the pressure and the intensity of sort of big rugby matches?
I think, and I've had experiences with scholars over the years, which have been, I wouldn't say stressful, but where you get the phone call the day after saying, look, I was at the game and this was said or that happened, and it's usually involving an incident, or maybe it's someone in the crowd, or maybe sometimes it's the coaches who, for whatever reason, there's a falling out of ideas. That's when you do a lot of listening, because you're trying to work out where they are on the journey. And I can remember with Christoph when he was starting, he had a particularly difficult game once down on the south coast, and he rang me on the way back, and I said, right, the usual thing I want you to do is you tell me what's happened so I can understand what's in your head. That's the place you start, their head, not your own head. And I said to Christoph, can you tell me what happened? And his words to me were, how long have you got? At which point I thought, right, okay. And I think that conversation probably went on for an hour. But what you're looking for them to be able to do is to self-analyze. That people do support referees, we've got a coaching network, etc. But what's really important is that they begin to take control of their own learning. So I would say to them, right, what happened in the front row? And if they say, well, there was a couple of penalties, I said, well, I need to know a bit more than that, please. Tell me what the tight head was doing. Tell me what the loose head's name was. Tell me how the hooker engaged the scrum. So you're constantly trying to make them or help them to become their own coaches. And we talk about athlete-centered learning. Refereeing, you are on your own. If you take a football referee, he'll turn up locally on his own or her own, and they will take charge of that game. They'll take charge of that environment. There's nobody there. There's no coach shouting at them. They're not going to be replaced at half time. No one's going to substitute them in the 72nd minute. So they become very, very skillful at managing the environment and then reflecting. Now, again, we talk about transferable skills in refereeing. If you were looking at an employment market, you've got some very powerful very powerful skills, knowledge, and attitude that refereeing entails every week, and they do it because they love it.
A couple more questions. What advice would you give to someone aspiring to become a rugby referee at the elite level, or even just a referee in general?
I think it's an interesting conversation to have with people. When they step over the line to do it, they take on a huge amount of responsibility. And I think one of the bottom lines is passion. You love the sport. Now, not just love refereeing, you love to watch rugby or football or netball. You like to be involved in that as a team. And I think people have got to, one of the things you have to realise is again, as I said, it's a movie, not a snapshot, that you will develop, but there are people there to help you. That everything that's happened has probably happened before. Again, the transferable skills I think that people get from refereeing should not be forgotten. Communication is really important, and I talk about 360 communication. So you're communicating instantly with the people you're working with, who are the players. You're very quickly communicating with your own team, almost in real time now. You see it happening with touch judges and TMOs. You're then communicating with the bigger crowd, which is the ones that are actually watching. There's 80,000 people watching a game. And I remember refereeing a game between Georgia and Russia where the advice from my coach was every single person in that stadium needs to understand what decision was made, and the only way you're going to do that is through your signals. So if your signals are clear, and if you watch European football games, the refereeing, you may not be able to hear what's going on, but the signalling and the body language at that point is really, really strong, and it always resonated with me on that. You're also communicating because games are now analysed, so you need to make sure that what you've done passes the sniff test, if you like, with analysis. This is why I made the decision. I can then justify this decision, or I can explain why I came to this decision. So there's a massive communication. Decision making itself isn't something that we're necessarily taught as a lesson at school. I was a school teacher. When did we do decision making? I don't remember doing decision making. Do you remember doing decision? No, I don't remember doing decision making. So that is something else that we're starting to unpack now. And you look at thinking fast and thinking slow, and refereeing is sometimes you have to make an instant decision, sometimes you stop completely, you put your foot on the ball and you go and have a conversation. Two different levels of decision making, which is a fascinating subject to get into. People take responsibility of an environment. If you turn up, even if you're turning up at, say, a local game of rugby or football, you are their referee. They are pleased to see you, believe it or not, most of the time, because you're the person that's the difference, that you're the neutral person, you're the person that's going to help them enjoy their game. People should look after them. They should love their referee, even if they make mistakes, and appreciate what they're doing. So that young person will turn up and take a lot of responsibility. Leadership of yourself is really important. You are your own CEO. If you're the person who drives yourself to the ground, who gets yourself changed, who turns up on time, who meets the committee, who then referees the game, who then speaks to people afterwards, who then has to fill in any reports. This isn't all refereeing is, but it's that leadership of yourself is really important. Resilience, I will mention resilience. It's a topic that people talk about in employment and workplaces. You do learn resilience. Yeah. There are days when it doesn't go so well, and that's when you need to talk to people. And we do a lot of work with sports psychologists. They have the opportunity to speak to sports psychologists, both as a group and as individuals. That's not a plaster. That's not saying we're going to make, it's just teaching people better ways of understanding what's going on and how they can relate to people. So we do that. And the last thing I'd say is, just in the local community, the university is here to serve the community. I look at 80 people who've come along and refereed. If they only do 10 games each, that's 800. And one lad did 137 games in 1 year. So if we multiply the number of games, we're into the thousands and thousands that these young people have gone out in the community and refereed and given something back. And obviously the community has given them a huge bit back as well. The local referee associations, the Gloucester Referee Society, the Cheltenham Art Referees, football referees, have all helped grow these people.
Final question from me. Obviously, World Cup is on at the moment. Who do you think is going to win?
Well, as a referee, it was very wrong of me to predict. And obviously, as an Englishman, I would say England every time. Look, it's what's really exciting about this World Cup is how open it is. I wouldn't like to say, but I think England are on the way up. And my wife is Welsh, so I'd have to say that, obviously the Welsh were doing very well. I went to Swansea University, so yeah. But I can't give a specific answer except to say, look, it's going to get really exciting. And obviously, we're hoping that our guys are involved in those matches, and they've yeah, it's just brilliant to have a couple from the university there.